Okay, we'll get started. Thank you all for being here. Diehards, people that aren't afraid to go out in the weather, we appreciate it. I just want to make a couple of announcements. Tomorrow at 5:30 in the Griggs Center, which is by the Multicultural Center, the second floor of Kirby, Nathan Paul will discuss breaking barriers, how to acquire and maintain multiple languages. And Nathan is a UMD grad. He's here tonight. And he has studied over the years Spanish, Russian, German, and Chinese. He just recently came back from living in China for 10 years, so he's going to share some tips on learning multiple languages. And then Thursday at noon here in the Rotunda, he'll be discussing his life in China. And we call it study, work, lockdown, and a heavy metal band, because he was in a heavy metal band in China, so he can tell you a little bit about that. And then we're co-sponsoring a hybrid talk tomorrow at noon in Kirby Plaza 312, which is a conversation on the cost of colonialism, a global healthcare crisis for trans and queer communities. And it's featuring a speaker from Pakistan, and there'll be discussants from our community. If you want the link, they had a really big, long, drawn-out link for the Zoom talk. You can let me know, and I'll get it to you. But tonight, of course, we're here to hear for Tom Hanson, who is our Alworth Institute Diplomat in residence. He is a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, and I know many of you are familiar with him. We think now it's maybe 14 years that Tom has been coming up to UMD every semester, primarily to work with students on internships and careers with the Foreign Service, and we've been pretty successful in our students getting those internships. In fact, we have one working in D.C. now, the State Department, and one that will be going overseas. We're not sure where this summer, and that's thanks to Tom's work with them. Give you a little background. When with the U.S. Department of State, Tom Hanson's foreign postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and Georgia. He also assisted in opening new embassies in Mongolia and Estonia. Hanson has worked on the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. He was director for NATO and European Affairs at the Atlantic Council of the United States in D.C. He serves on the Paul-Minneapolis Committee on Foreign Relations and as a lecturer consultant for the Minnesota International Center. He's an occasional foreign affairs commentator for Minnesota Public Radio and serves on the boards of the Minneapolis chapter of the Oslo Center for Peace. He's also currently teaching at Carleton and does that periodically in a couple of different places in the state. He graduated from the University of Minnesota with a BA in International Relations. He holds graduate degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, the Geneva Institute of Advanced Studies in Switzerland, and the National School of Administration in Paris, France. So let's give Tom Hanson a round of applause, and we'll get right to it.
Well, thanks, Cindy, and it's great to see everybody in person again, and thanks for turning out on a night like this, although I guess a night like this in Duluth is considered mild, right? So anyway, great to see you all. Tonight we'll be talking about the extremely important country of China. I really had to scramble to put this together. There's so much happening right now, real time, with Xi Jinping in Moscow right now and a number of other developments. So, China-U.S. relations are at the center of so much that's going on right now in the world, obviously, and will be increasingly so. It's a country that we really need to understand. And it's a country that comes from a very different civilizational space from ours. And therefore, it's our responsibility, actually, to understand China on its own terms. And so in addition to discussing the political situation today and foreign policy, I'm going to try to sketch out a few historical points that make it easier to understand where China's coming from in this current era. In addition, I think that China and the U.S. are at the center of what might be the basic contradiction of this era, or the basic disconnect. And this disconnect is appearing more and more places. For example, at this year's Davos conference. So here it is. There it is. Looks kind of like Duluth. I mean, there's Davos, Switzerland, where every January the global economic and political elite comes together. About 1,200 entrepreneurs, political leaders. They discuss the global economy. There was one meeting this year about global inequality. That was it. But they get into all kinds of other issues. And they always ask the attendees, what are the main threats coming ahead? How do you see the world over the next 2 and the next 10 years? So this year there was a mood of optimism actually at Davos because for 3 reasons. China is opening up again after the COVID lockdowns, and that's going to stimulate the global economy. Energy prices, LNG prices have come down. Last summer, they were way high in Europe because of Ukraine. They've come down 85%. And so the Western economies especially are in better shape than we would have expected. And then finally, U.S. subsidies. The United States is beginning to subsidize its economy, trying to draw high-tech industry to the U.S. We're providing billions of dollars of subsidies to corporations that will locate here. I'll talk much more about this later, which also is a stimulant for the global economy. So this was all good for the Davos men and women there. But there are 2 problems. All of this is inflationary. And kind of what it means is that the Fed, in trying to battle inflation here in the U.S., it's a little bit out of their hands, frankly. It's not the traditional supply and demand situation in the U.S. that's driving this. It's a lot of global factors. And then second, what we are doing is perceived by many countries, including our own allies, as protectionist. That there may be an era of protectionism now of countries subsidizing their economies. And I'll discuss that in a minute, too. But when it came to the threat perception, in the report for this year, 2 years out, all the threats were geopolitical. It was Ukraine, the U.S.-China tensions, et cetera, et cetera. 10 years out, all the threats have to do with sustainability, with climate, these deeper threats that are a challenge for all of us. And the conclusion from Davos this year was that these short-term geopolitical risks are crowding out concerns about long-term pressures on the planet. Geopolitical rivalries are heightening economic constraints and further exacerbating both short-term and longer-term risks. In other words, we're letting geopolitical considerations get in the way of global cooperation on the real threats. Now, this is exactly reflected, by the way, this is what it looks like from the veranda of the main building, as they look out at this messy world. This dichotomy is also reflected in the most recent U.S. national security strategy, which was released last October. So for the U.S. government now, we're at an inflection point. The next 10 years will be decisive. This is what the UN is telling us about climate, but it's also what the Biden administration believes in terms of the struggle between autocracy and democracy, which is one of their main framing devices for what's going on. Also, the next 10 years, decisive. An inflection point. So, 2 main threats. The most important threat, China. China, as the most consequential geopolitical challenge, as it seeks to, this is wording from this document, as it seeks to reshape the international order. And of course, since it's an order that we created after World War II, we are not necessarily down with this idea. The second threat, though, is climate, pandemics, all these existential threats that require us to cooperate with other countries. So that's exactly the 2-year idea at Davos and the 10-year. This document does not prioritize, and it's been described as schizophrenic by many commentators. Because do these 2 challenges fit together? So for example, in this document, and I'm quoting again, no country should withhold progress on existential transnational issues like climate change just because of bilateral differences. A kind of an a la carte approach. The problem is China does not buy that. In Chinese statecraft, Chinese tradition, everything has to do with relations, guanxi as they call it. You have good relations and you don't. Nothing is decided until everything is. And the idea of an a la carte relationship is foreign to the Chinese mindset. And so as long as we are pressing on Taiwan, pressing on tech, the Chinese have begun to withhold cooperation. On climate, for example, John Kerry is very frustrated, especially since the Pelosi visit, Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. The Chinese have ratcheted back. They are no longer pressuring Kim Jong-un in North Korea. You may have read that he is in overdrive now, developing his nuclear arsenal and missiles. One reason is that the Chinese are not putting on the brakes as much. And just as important, fentanyl. Most of the components for fentanyl come from China. They get into the hands of Mexican cartels and then are brought for this. You can see one of the main routes for these components is right across the north here. I really think that if Duluth and Thief River Falls and other northern tier cities have a problem, it's because a lot of stuff's coming in this way. So the U.S. government has concluded this is not a Chinese government. I mean, it's not like they're trying to get revenge for the opium wars of the 19th century by flooding us with fentanyl. These are criminal groups in China that are doing this. And the Chinese have cooperated in the past in rolling up these groups, but not recently because of this dichotomy that I've been referring to. The US DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, estimates that they seized enough fentanyl last year to kill every American. Record amounts are coming in, and they're coming in disguised as Oxycontin pills. In other words, young people are taking what they think is Oxycontin, and they're dying because it's actually fentanyl. And of course, these are the cartels that are doing this. 379 million deadly doses came in last year. So the bottom line here is that cooperation on key issues is being impeded by the geopolitical tensions, the old style, territorial or whatever geopolitical tensions, and of course Ukraine doesn't help. Now the shoot down of the balloon, we can talk about that a lot. I mean, it's really spy versus spy. Everybody's spying on everybody. A lot of information comes from satellites. You don't really need balloons that much. In any event, this was a huge setback because it caused Tony Blinken to cancel his visit to Beijing, which would have kind of stepped up the relationship again. Number one on his agenda was fentanyl. If he had gone to Beijing, that would have been the number one thing he would want to discuss for the Chinese, and we missed that opportunity. There are really, those of you old enough to remember, there are a lot of parallels with the U-2 plane shot down in 1960. This was a high-flying spy balloon, or rather airplane. Gary Powers, the pilot. The Soviets shot it down. For the first week, the United States government said it was a weather airplane. It was just looking at the weather. And we didn't know that they had salvaged the wreckage and had actually captured the pilot alive. So after a week or so, they showed the photos, and it became, an incident and led to the canceling of a major summit in Vienna. Back then, there was something called the Spirit of Camp David between Eisenhower and Khrushchev at the end of the Eisenhower administration. People think that if that second summit had taken place, the relationship might have been on a more even keel, because the next year you had the Berlin Wall crisis, and the year after you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, as I say, there's a kind of a parallelism here to where we are. Now, it's ironic that the relationship is in such bad shape. When Xi Jinping came in 2012, 2013, his first summit with Obama was in a place called Sunnylands in California, and Xi came with an agenda that was very cultural, if you will. He wanted to talk about Thucydides. This was the Chinese proposing this. They were proposing to talk about something from Western culture, because Thucydides wrote in the Peloponnesian Wars that when you have a rising power and a status quo power that feels challenged, there's always war. And so Xi's message to Obama was, we have to be very careful here with this relationship. History is against us. Yes, we are a rising power. You are a status quo. We got to be really, really careful. And now, flash forward 10 years later, and it's going totally the other direction for the moment, at least. Now, there's a really good book about U.S. and China, a beautiful country. The Chinese call America Meiguo, which means beautiful country, and then the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo. And John Pomfret sketches the whole history and how always Chinese relations with America and vice versa have gone back and forth, from fascination to estrangement and back and forth. This is a pattern that's like that. And so, we may be about to have it swing back again, who knows? Because in the 19th century, we brought a lot of Chinese labor over to build our railroads to the west, major contribution. And within a few years, we passed our first anti-immigration act ever to try to ban Chinese from coming in. So that's just an example, really, of the backing and forthing. Now, part of the fascination with China was the many missionaries who went over to China in the 19th, early 20th century. And most of the real experts on China, up until even recently, were offspring of the missionaries who went over there. And perhaps the most famous is a gentleman named John King Fairbank, who was a missionary son, learned Chinese. He became the preeminent scholar of China. The Fairbank Center at Harvard is named after him. He taught his whole career at Harvard University. And he wrote a lot about the historical aspects of Chinese foreign policy and Chinese culture, and what the West would need to understand about China. And he had three main points about understanding China from its history. Number one, the primacy of inner Asia. All through Chinese history, the Han Chinese, which are about 92% of China even today, settled in these three river basins on the coast. And as for instance, the Han Dynasty began, you had the Great Wall separating these agricultural sedentary Han Chinese from a world of nomads, horse-riding nomads on the other side. And the threat always came from that side, not from the sea. So here you see the breakdown today within China, the remnants of those inner Asian peoples who for many periods in Chinese history were stronger than the Han. You can see the Uyghurs out there in Xinjiang, which for China is very important now as a main transit point for the Belt and Road, and good share of their minerals and commodity wealth is in Xinjiang. And plus, they have this long history of always trying to pacify that region to begin with. So even though it's greatly diminished from what it was, it's still a concern of the Chinese. That's the first, primacy of inner Asia. Second, the Chinese idea of ruling and legitimacy through virtue. Now, this is a basic Confucian precept. And it's what led to, first of all, the spread of Chinese influence all through Asia, especially during the Tang Dynasty. The aesthetic of Japan, if you go to Japan, you're really seeing the Tang Dynasty aesthetic because the Japanese imprinted on that in their encounter with China. So it led to sort of a system of suzerainty where foreign countries and even like foreign merchants would pay homage to the virtue of the emperor. Even the early merchants from Portugal and Holland and England who would go through the whole ritual. And ultimately, this was for domestic consumption in China. In other words, the Chinese, as long as external people would come and do that, they could say to the Chinese population, you see, the emperor is virtuous. He is recognized universally as virtuous, and this is part of the legitimacy, once again, of the emperor. Obviously, they didn't control everybody outside. There was a sense of barbarians beyond the certain gates. And when the inner Asia threat really exploded with the Mongols and creating the Yuan dynasty, that whole image of the virtuous Han Chinese emperor was blown apart. But at every chance, they reconstituted it. So, for example, in the Ming dynasty, it came back again. Now, the Ming, actually, it was during the Ming dynasty that the third primacy of Inner Asia, the idea of ruling through virtue, and then disesteem or downplaying the importance of sea power. Now, this sounds ironic right now because the Chinese are developing a navy now. The people in Washington claim they may have more ships than we have now. A lot of what they're doing is smaller ships that are there to defend Taiwan, defend the Armenia. They aren't really going for a global navy yet. They don't have a lot of aircraft carriers. You can still say that the Chinese are not as oriented toward the sea as they are toward inland, because that's where the Belt and Road Initiative is going, is right inland to the west. But there was a moment in the early 1400s when China had by far the most extensive and most developed navy in the world. So these are the voyages of Zheng He, who went all over the place in junks like this. Here they are compared to the size of the Vasco da Gama boat at the time. 26, or was it 19 of these would sail with 26,000 people. And these were big emissaries. The Chinese would sail country to country and just present themselves. It wasn't conquest. It was establishing, ideally, tributary relations. So at this stage, China could easily, this is way before the Europeans began encroaching. The Portuguese arrived in 1513, and the first time that the threat started coming from sea. So the problem was that for the Ming, the threat seems still to be from the Mongols and the Tibetans. So that in 1430, basically the Ming told Zheng He to go home, nice voyage, really happy you did it, and basically they stood down their navy. So as Europe was becoming a naval power, China was still oriented inward. That continued under the Qing. So the Yuan was a Mongol dynasty, the Qing was a Manchu dynasty, not Han. In fact, they humiliated the Han by making them wear long pigtails, which were to symbolize the horses, the tail of the horses of the nomads. So as I say, the Han Chinese, it's a combination of feeling superior, but then also being humiliated, both at the same time. So the Qing, though, made sure that Tibet was pacified. I find it very ironic that in 1904, the British encouraged the Chinese to take over Tibet because they were afraid that Russia would come in. They had some support for doing that. That's the Potala Palace. Now, the rooms for the Dalai Lama are just as they were when he left. Even his clothing is still hanging on the hook there. It's very strange. Anyway, and then, of course, Xinjiang. The Qing made sure that they kept control of Xinjiang, and that is, as I say, so important for China today. So it was in 1839 that the West really arrived with the Opium Wars. And this begins what the Chinese call the century of humiliation. I believe it's also referred to as guo, pardon my pronunciation, guo chi, which means eating bitterness. A lot of what China's doing now in terms of trying to rejuvenate the Chinese nation is in relation to what they perceive as a century of real tragedy and humiliation. So what did that century look like? Well, obviously the Opium Wars, and here you can see the first Opium War, 1839. That's kind of what this period dates from. The Chinese became hooked on opium. U.S. merchants were involved in the opium trade. We got our opium from the Ottoman Empire. The British got theirs from the Raj. And it was part of what they called the triangular trade. Here you can see these long tail-like things that the Han were forced to wear. So, I mean, China in the late 19th century was basically being carved up by the Western powers. Each had a sphere in which they had special trade relationships. China was on its knees. And this was worse in some ways than the subjugation. And of course, they'd been under the Manchus anyway when this happened. So for the Han, specifically the Han, this was like a period of double humiliation. And then when in 1911, the last dynasty collapsed, China went into a terrible period of warlordism. And the warlords so the country was splintering. And different Western countries were supporting different warlords. Now and of course the Kuomintang there is one of them. And then right on the heels of this, and here are some of the warlords of the time. You can see the people who were vying for power in China during this period of humiliation. And then of course the Japanese finally come in. They had taken Manchuria long since, they had taken Taiwan, and they moved in then into China. This is the scene in Nanjing for the rape of Nanjing, which all Chinese learn about. There's a monument that is to this atrocity. So it culminates with the Japanese occupation. One of the better books about China right now is called Haunted by Chaos by Sulman Wasif Khan. He's at the Fletcher School in Harvard. And basically saying that a lot of motivation for China comes out of this period and out of the fear of future fragmentation if things are not managed correctly. And the sense that the West would like to do that if they could. So our real involvement, and now we're getting into the policies, our real involvement starts, of course, with the Chinese Civil War, in which we strongly supported Chiang Kai-shek. The communists and the Kuomintang had cooperated against the Japanese, but as soon as the Japanese were defeated, they fell into conflict, and it all settled on Taiwan. Because the communists drove the Kuomintang, the nationalists, to the coast. They were trapped. It would have been like Dunkirk. It would have been the end of the Chinese Civil War. But the United States intervened. And with our Fifth Fleet, we transported tens of thousands of Kuomintang from this boxed-in coast over to Taiwan. And then we put our ships between Taiwan and the mainland to protect this new Taiwan. For China, this was intervention in a civil war. And for China today, Taiwan is an unfinished civil war. It's something that has to be, from their point of view, has to be brought to resolution at some point, because they believe that Taiwan is part of China, as we all know. So in the 1950s, a very close relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. In Congress, people would give speeches saying we have to unleash Chiang Kai-shek and have him go back and conquer the mainland, and we'll be there with him. This was, of course, totally unrealistic. At this time, we've always had a one China policy. In these years, the one China was Taiwan. They had a seat in the UN Security Council. They were one of the 5 powers in the UN Security Council with our support, along with Russia, US, France, and Britain. So this changed in 1971 when Nixon visited China. Why did this happen? Well, it wasn't because we wanted to make China a responsible stakeholder, which you'll sometimes hear. This was all about great power politics. It was all about separating China from Russia, from the Soviet Union. This was the way the Cold War began to draw to an end. In this triad of large powers, we successfully split 2 powers that were facing us and drew one of them onto our side, and the rest was history. It's very ironic that right now the opposite is happening. Our policy is very consciously or unconsciously driving those two together. So yes, the Nixon period was a major geopolitical move on the chessboard. Now, in 1979, then this came to fruition with the signing with Deng Xiaoping. We adopted the One China policy. This time, though, the One China was the People's Republic. We had Taiwan leave the Security Council at the UN. The People's Republic became a member of the Security Council. We closed our embassy in Taiwan. We no longer had real diplomatic relations. We had an interest section in Taiwan. We opened our embassy then in Beijing. And things were on track to move eventually toward globalization, with China opening increasingly and Western capital seeking the cheapest labor worldwide and finding it in China, as we all know. So, you know, it's kind of a gallery of presidents in these good years of moving toward globalization. Of course, the Reagans were actually favorable toward China. George H.W. Bush had been our representative in Beijing. Bill Clinton, the festively attired George W. Bush. So this was the period of, globalization, U.S. very open to China, our economic class making a lot of money from the cheap labor in China, and all of us profiting from the cheap products at Walmart and Target, and it just seemed to be going swimmingly. It began to change with Obama. The Obama administration, and by the way, the advisors in the Obama administration, the key ones, are the same ones under Biden. It's the same people like Kurt Campbell. They began to see China's rise as a geopolitical threat. Kurt Campbell said in 2008, our allies are going to sleep on us in Asia. We've got to shake them awake. They are taking China's rise without thinking about the security. So the Obama team started making some moves that were geopolitical. And at that point, the Chinese antenna went up right away. By 2010, they were sensing that the U.S. was moving slowly toward trying to constrain their rise, already in 2010, even before Xi Jinping came in. Now, with Trump, it was all about trade. It was all about intellectual property. He didn't really think much in geopolitical terms, but it was like, hey, they're cheating us. We deserve a better deal. And so you started having all of these tariffs that we started rolling out in a rather incoherent way, oftentimes, but it added to the pressures. Now with Biden, you have a team that is resolutely focused on the geopolitical and is determined to retain U.S. hegemony in Asia and in Europe, by the way. They're declaring this to be a vital U.S. national interest. So, and Xi Jinping, meanwhile, is entering his third term. And so we see the tensions. Now, I'll describe how this is playing out now during the Biden years. First, just to take a little bit of a look at China today. So Xi Jinping, yes, is a strong leader. He's showing signs of trying to revivify this idea of governance by virtue. A lot of the way he talks about things in terms of rejuvenating the nation, he uses a lot of Confucian imagery and ideas. Now, his basic idea is that this is the revitalization of the nation, and think again of that 100-year period, with two dates. One's already passed, 100 years of the Communist Party, and the big one will be 2049, 100th anniversary of the People's Republic. They're really gearing up for that. And they also have announced the China 2025 initiative. They want to be self-sufficient in high tech by 2025. Actually, they announced that even before we did, and part of what we did was a reaction to that. Now, he's bringing Marx back, so the party is more present in daily life. I'm sure we see this in the universities. Even In this last People's Congress, which just finished last month, he's tightening the control of the party, not the government, but the party over the financial sector and over government agencies. So that is definitely a step, toward greater control and even Marxist ideas. Xi Jinping says, Marx said to become socialist or communist, you have to go through capitalism. You can't skip that stage. It's like science. So she says, we and the Russians, we were feudal when we became communists. That's why things didn't work out. That's why I had so many problems. But then he says, but since Deng Xiaoping, we've now gone through our capitalist phase. We've actually now completed it, and now we can start moving more towards socialism, which is an interesting way to twist the... But he's also bringing back Confucius in ways that I'll describe in a minute. Now, China has a lot of weaknesses, one is just the lack of arable land. As you can see here in brown, they have a lot of steppe, a lot of kind of grasslands, a desert. So this is why they have to import so much, including from us. Minnesota exports to China are at record levels, in spite of the bad relationship. So this is a weakness for them. They're starting to realize that they are going to be one of the worst impacted countries by climate change. They had an unprecedented heat wave last summer, never recorded before, in exactly that Han heartland where they have their agriculture. If this continues, it's going to be a big issue for China. And it's one reason that they are, moving on green technology the way they are. We all hear about the housing crisis, the overbuilding, the potential debt issues in the property sector. They keep trying to wind that down, but it's not easy. And so this is another instability they face. Demographics, latest UN projections, if you look at China down below there, India is right now surpassing China as the most populous country in the world. China goes down to 2050, but look what happens down to 2100. If the UN is right, the Chinese population goes to 770,000 from 1.4 billion. It's almost cutting in half. Now, a lot can happen, obviously, between now and then. It's a long ways off, but that's the UN's best estimate. I'm always, we always talk about how you need a big population for growth. In the modern economy with sustainability and all the new technologies of AI and robotics, do we really need that many workers? I ask myself that, whether countries that have large and growing populations will be the ones in the sweet spot, or whether there'll be countries that have just massive unemployment. Anyway, I think it's at least a question. So one of the rising young scholars in DC is a guy named Hal Brands at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He believes there's going to be conflict with China. The only person I know who's more downbeat on China is Gordon Chang, who has been around for a long time predicting doom and gloom. So Hal has gone from saying, China's rise threatens us, to saying China's domestic problems threaten us. China may fail, and if they do, then they'll become aggressive in their foreign policy. So he's switched his argument around, but with the same result, that there's going to be conflict with China. Now, he's one voice. There are many other voices that disagree. Jessica Chen Weiss, for example, has written some wonderful articles about how we're overhyping the China threat. So you're hearing both sides in Washington right now. And of course, China is doing some, they're showing themselves to be very strong in long-term projects. Chinese leaders tend to be engineers, maybe from managing those 3 rivers over so many centuries. Our politicians tend to be lawyers. And so the Chinese are pretty good at long-term planning. For example, the Belt and Road is going forward. You hear problems, but in fact, it's moving along. And as they're coming out of the COVID period, and China is succeeding in restructuring debts. We talk about debt trap diplomacy, but it's a little more nuanced than that, in fact. There's a woman named Deborah Breudegam who's been writing about this. I think she's at Georgetown, very well documenting what's actually happening in the Belt and Road. But this is the kind of project, once again, this is looking in past inner Asia, looking across Eurasia. And it's part of what is drawing China together with countries like Russia and Iran. Because it's like when we pivoted to Asia, China pivoted into Eurasia. It's kind of ironic. The other thing is they are hyperactive in the global economy. They are increasing their trade everywhere. They've got problems with us and with the Europeans, but everywhere else. Their trade with Asia is up 71% in the past 3 years. Obviously, their trade with Russia is way up. It's up about 23% just in the past year. Their exports to the global south have doubled in the last 3 years. And it's because of organizations like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a major trade deal. It includes a number of our allies, as you can see. We aren't part of it. This is deepening supply chains all through Asia. And so China is still the driver economically in Asia. They are also starting to, Xi Jinping is trying to come back from the wolf warrior image that got going during COVID, right? So he is very active now in the international scene. Here he is visiting Mohammed bin Salman a few months ago in Saudi Arabia. A major deal was signed where Saudi Arabia agrees now to no longer use the dollar in its trade with China, which is its biggest energy consumer. It's going to be in yuan. It's going to be through currency swaps. This is part of a larger policy now by China to create a digital currency linked to commodities in conjunction with Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. These 5 countries have announced the development now of this digital currency. The Chinese are buying up gold right now at a fast pace around the world. Our dollar used to be linked to gold until the Nixon shocks in the early 1970s. They'll have the same problem with this, trying to keep that link, but in an early stage, trying to slowly create a financial zone that might work in the early stages. And they are going to other countries. They're going to countries like Indonesia and saying, we are able now to buy, with Russia, we don't use dollars anymore. We can use yuan and rubles. India is agreeing to currency swaps with us. We no longer use the dollar. So, Indonesia, we'd love to buy things from you, but, it's just too expensive if you ask us to use dollars or euros. So the Indonesians are shifting. Just 3 days ago, Widodo, the head of Indonesia, announced that Visa and MasterCard will be banned in Indonesia from now on, as Indonesia develops its own credit card. And so you're starting to see a fragmentation of the global financial system underway. Part of it is a result of our sanctions against Russia, where when we seize Russia's half of their national surplus parked in Western banks, that set off alarm countries. And we threatened to do the same. Janet Yellen threatened to do the same thing to China if they did anything on Taiwan. So everyone is trying to move away now, or a lot of these countries are trying to get out from under the dollar. And of course, we just saw how China is translating some of this now into diplomatic activity, coming into the Middle East and sort of midwifing, if you will, a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which, Obama famously said the key to the Middle East is that Iran and Saudi Arabia have to learn to share the neighborhood. Our foreign policy never succeeded in doing this because we were seen as too anti-Iranian and too pro-Saudi. Whereas the Chinese come in as a kind of a third party and are able to pull this off. Now, whether this will last is anybody's guess. But a lot of people are really paying attention to this in Washington, this new activism. And of course, the main problem, and this gets back to Nixon in China, is that China and Russia now are coming together into a very, very, very close relationship. Each has what the other needs. China, needs the vast commodities. China is in the top 3 exporters of almost all major commodities. It's not just gas and oil. It's It's a wide range of commodities, all of which China needs. They imported, I think, about $100 billion worth of Chinese energy resources, and it's going to be going up and up as they build a new pipeline. I mean, Russia realizes that the markets in the West are now not going to come back anytime soon. So this is a major rewiring of the global economy that's going on. And so in Moscow in the future, they won't be driving Mercedes. They'll be driving Chinese or other vehicles. It's going to be a relationship of China, providing the manufactured goods, with Russia very much the junior partner. A little bit the way India was to Britain during that period, actually, if you think about it. And so, obviously the Russians don't like to think about it that way. They think, well, they need us and we're equal with them. But in fact, but Russia feels it has an alternative. It feels that 400 years of aspiring to Europe are over, and that it's a new situation. Now, both China and Russia, they had a summit on February 4th last year at the Olympics before the Russian invasion. They're just having one right now in Beijing. They are all about appealing to the global South. The narratives that they're coming up with are all aimed at, I think I showed this in my last speech, but I just, at the blue and the orange there, what they now call the global majority. They no longer call it the global South. It's the global majority, with Africa moving toward 40% of the population by the end of the century, of course, Asia, South Asia. So what they're saying to the developing world is, we are with you. We want to deal with you on an equal basis. We won't tell you what kind of government you have to have. We just want to trade with you. And besides, why do you want to listen to this 8%, i.e. the West, which is a tiny minority, and it's all the former colonialists anyway? Why would you give them a time of day? So this is the narrative that they're using in the developing world. Washington is realizing that we're losing the game. For example, in most of the developing world, the inflation from food and energy are blamed on our sanctions, not on the Ukrainian invasion. And we are out there now trying to correct this incomplete view of what's going on. So this is why at the end of last year, Obama convened a U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. It's 55 countries. We realized that we've been so focused on Ukraine and on alliance management in NATO that we've lost the diplomatic game in the rest of the world. So Washington is very much now trying to recalibrate. The Foreign Service is going to try to ramp up now and do more. We have nobody in Africa. I mean, there are posts in Africa where the most senior diplomat is a first tour officer. And many of our embassies have no ambassador at all. And the Chinese probably outnumber us about 10-1 in terms of diplomats in any given country. And they just increased their diplomatic spending by 25% last year. The Chinese did. So there's a China challenge in diplomacy too. Now, final point, because this is really the key to the tensions between the U.S. and China today, and that's tech. We talked about this last time as well. China has moved ahead. Just 2 weeks ago, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is one of the main ones in Australia, issued the results of a one-year study. And they concluded that China now leads in 37 of the 44 key technologies for the future. They're ahead in 37 of 44. In some of these technologies, all of the world's top 10 leading research institutes are based in China. And they're spending a lot too. Now, it's interesting that this study was financed by the U.S. State Department, among others. I think that we want the American people to get the idea that we have to up our game on tech. Of course, China, with its long tradition of education, the old imperial exam system, we all seen it in the Chinese family. Education is such a high priority. This produces results. This is a modern testing scene in China. So yes, they're producing more engineers than the rest of the OECD combined. Now, so Trump, I'm almost done here. The Trump administration set up a commission to study AI. The Commission on Artificial Intelligence and the Defense Innovation Board. It was headed up by Eric Schmidt of Google. And it reported last year and also found that Chinese right now are slipping ahead of us in AI, quantum, and hypersonics. And all of these have military. And this was the key phrase, and it has tremendous implications for our own economy. The Schmidt report said about the U.S., private sector commercial interests are indifferent to the strategic implications of tech. Venture capital is especially oblivious. The idea is that Chinese advantage is that this is coordinated by the government. Profits are plowed back into research. They're not used for stock buybacks and dividends the way ours are. And in other words, there's a bipartisan consensus in Congress and the administration that we have to rein in our public sector. We have, in our own national interest, for national security reasons, we have to change the way we do things. In a sense, become a bit more like China. I'm not sure how this works. For the moment, it is taking, as I say, the form of subsidies. Estimated up to $450 billion worth of subsidies when you add it all up. As Jake Sullivan says, we must pursue as large a lead as possible in tech, and we have to bring technology back from Asia to the United States. And so we've got these different, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the idea being that we want to ban government funding for anything to do with China, limit what U.S. citizens and residents can do with China, and eventually restrict outbound investment to China. That's what's coming next. So here are the two people really, Jake Sullivan from Southwest High School, our own Jake, is one of the architects of this, and then Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary. And so I find this so interesting. Raimondo said last week in giving some details about this new legislation, she said, to receive cash from these subsidies that are very extensive, companies must agree not to expand capacity in China at all. They must not knowingly engage in any joint research or technology licensing with a foreign entity of concern. And that's most Chinese companies, because how do you ever know if they have contact with the Chinese military? Right? That's always the allegation. How can a company know for sure? Because the penalties are like 20 years in prison now in this, and if you go against some of this. This has teeth. But then, very interestingly, she announced that to get this money, any company may not use the money or profits for share buybacks or for dividend payments. Now here we're starting to direct the economy here. Here we're starting to tell the private sector what they can do. And by the way, the next provision that she emphasized was any company that gets this money must have affordable childcare. So you can see the kind of a lot of the democratic positions are being put on this thing. So, as I mentioned, our allies are kind of saying, wait a minute, this is protectionism. We're going to do the same thing. And lo and behold, the Europeans are starting to do this kind of same subsidy activity. The Economist is really not amused by this. A recent issue, as you can see, Zero Sum, the destructive logic that threatens globalization. It's all about what we're doing. And to quote The Economist, the economic policies that are being adopted by the Biden administration in the name of national security and competitiveness are so sweeping and clumsy that they are hurting allies as much as they are hurting enemies. And then they say, in this context, U.S. subsidies are similar to the 1930s protectionism. When after the Depression, the world economy kind of unraveled leading up to World War II. So what the U.S. is doing is similar to the 1930s protectionism that led to destabilization and war. in Washington, a lot of people see what's happening now is the 1930s, like we have to stand up to Hitler, right? So it's like the 1930s that way. The economists are saying, no, this is like the 1930s. The global economy is going to start unraveling. The UN announced recently that over 100 countries now, representing 90% of world GDP, are beginning to adopt similar policies. So Germany and France announced recently that, so in the EU, so where this goes. And The Economist finishes by saying, and by the way, the U.S. has just spent all this money on getting out of COVID. Of course, now we're bailing out banks too, Ukraine, everything. What about that? All these subsidies are massively expensive. Is the U.S., and as you know, Biden has a tax proposal which would tax the rich to try to offset some of this, but obviously it's not going anywhere. Really what it is, it's a campaign platform for 2024 is what it is. Now, I want to say that in the midst of all this mayhem, if you will, last year, U.S.-China trade reached a record high of $700 billion. Anyway, it's a very hard situation. Now, there's a new kid on the block. I'm going to finish now. There's a new committee that just got formed. It's headed by Mike Gallagher from right next door in Wisconsin, Republican from Wisconsin. It's called the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Communist Party of China. Not China, but the Communist Party itself. And they're starting to hear, their first hearing was on February 28th. The title of the hearing was The Chinese Communist Party Threat to America. And so they've declared over the next 2 years they want to selectively decouple from China. They're going to push for decoupling. Now, this is a congressional initiative, of course. It can only go so far. Meanwhile, on the Chinese side, they had their 20th Party Congress a couple months ago. Now they just had a big People's Congress, which is their parliament. Xi Jinping announced that China now is becoming the new choice for humanity. And here we're coming back to this virtue concept again. And he's just announced, he had last week a meeting with party leaders from all over. There's like 500 party leaders from all around the world. And he announced a global civilization initiative. Now, in other words, advocate respect for the diversity of civilizations. You know, he's saying if you want diversity in your country, shouldn't that also apply overseas? And actually, John Kennedy used to say that too, about diversity globally. So you see, this is really China and the Chinese leader as a virtuous force in the world. Now, obviously, there's a subtext here. The United States talks about universal values all the time. Well, this kind of implies that values, no, they're not really universal. They're civilizational. And so, therefore, we have to respect different civilizations with their value structures, right? So, as I say, I think that coming out of COVID and after the whole wolf warrior period, the Chinese are very much trying to. And I thought it was interesting that in his summit now with Xi, they're playing up the aspects of Russian civilization. Right? There's all kinds of imagery coming out of that summit where it's old Russia. Right? So anyway, we'll see where this goes. I find it very interesting that today, as Xi Jinping is in China, or is in Russia, Kishida, the Prime Minister of Japan, visited Ukraine. I mean, this is a clear, Japan is part of the Western Alliance. And this has implications for Asia, because we're trying to bring NATO more and more into Asia, with Japan and South Korea the linchpin. So I just long for the day when we get back to the good old G20 as a functioning body where all these different groups are not breaking down into blocks the way they are, into political and financial blocks, but actually are back to cooperating. And finally, I hope that this side of the equation gets a little more attention in the midst of what's going on, just as they were saying at Davos. So I'll stop there. I went on too long, but I'm really interested in your questions as well. Yes.
We can take some questions until
I'll repeat them, yes, absolutely, yeah.
So, color me a skeptic. My background is more with Russian studies, but I guess I'm skeptical that the panda is as friendly as it seems in the final slide. When I look at the Belt and Road and I look at what you call the death trap, to me it seems like more of a real thing. I'm also remembering the days when we and the Russians competed for influence in Africa.
Yep, all through the Cold War.
Correct. And they took their hits, we took our hits, and net, not much happened throughout that entire subcontinent. So, I'm kind of looking at this with something with Jaundice Dye. Do you buy at all that final slide in which she was talking about the relative values of, yes, there it is.
Well, sure, yeah. So there's a lot to be skeptical about in this. Anybody who remembers the Cold War and the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in what was then called the developing world, it was kind of a wash. And I sense that you have skepticism about the durability of a China-Russia relationship. I mean, they've broken apart in the past, and then can we really buy this as something significant? I mean, I see it as redolent of some Chinese tradition. You know, I mean, John King Fairbank always said, eventually we're going to see the Sinization of Chinese communism. That a lot of these Chinese attributes are going to start coming up again. They are deep and historical, and I mean, Confucius kind of came back in recent years, and Xi Jinping actually, when he talks to the Chinese people, he takes a kind of like a mentor approach to things. So I think for Chinese domestic consumption, this is effective. In other words, the Chinese people see Xi out there trying to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, meeting with everyone. He has a global security initiative, he has a global development initiative, and now he has a global civilization initiative, right? It's a narrative, and I think it's just like the old suzerainty system in old China was very much an issue of legitimacy at home. I think this is too. I mean, and out in the developing world, what they're interested in is the bottom line. Who will help us develop? Who will come in with investment? Who will not ask us about our domestic politics, right? Rather than this. And there, compared to the Cold War, we've stepped back from the game. We are not as active. I mean, our USAID is nowhere near as active as it was during the Cold War. We are not present. Our embassies are way gutted. So we are not staffed up right now to compete with China, whatever their narrative is. And that's why we're having these new. By the way, I find it really ironic that. So she is saying to everybody, "I respect your civilization. You respect my civilization. There's no such thing as universal, rights or whatever." Remember when Trump went to the UN and said, "America first, but every one of you should put your country first too. Let's have a world of basically saying, why are we here at the UN? Same thing. Be like us. Be a nationalist country. So this is not the same thing exactly, but yeah. And the China. Zbigniew Brzezinski always said the danger for the U.S. would be if we ever created common grievances among Iran, Russia, and China that pushed them together. The implication being they wouldn't come together naturally. It would only be if they felt pressed that they would come together that way. Because China and Russia don't really trust each other historically. And they broke apart in the 60s. Yeah.
Thinking back to your comments about the Biden administration's attitude and saying that the staff there particularly seemed to be very focused on reestablishing U.S. hegemony.
Yeah.
And I frankly am totally at loss as to what that would mean for them, and
right.
how you would end up saying that we should perceive that, and especially have any of them actually recognize that we're just 4 years, or just a couple years past 4 years of the Trump administration, and there isn't anything that looks like a policy in the United States that could survive a change of political party in the White House.
Well, this is part of the disconnect that exists between the blob, that whole advisor class in DC, and then our domestic politics. No, I agree that we may be kind of overreaching here, but the policy since World War II has always been to maintain hegemony. I mean, we learned in World War II when we faced a threat from Germany in Europe and from Japan in Asia, that the one thing that can threaten us is if a hegemon ever emerges in either of those regions. And our policy, that's what the Cold War was about, was to keep Russia from being a hegemon in Europe. And right now, the number one issue is trying to make sure that China doesn't become a hegemon in Asia, but we're also worried about what Russia's doing. So that policy, it's not stated as much as often. I mean, you'll see it, for example, at the Congressional Research Service, which produces policy papers for Congress. They refer to it all the time. And when we had General Joseph Votel recently at the Committee on Foreign Relations, he's from Minnesota. He was commander in Middle East and Europe. I had a long talk with him about that. And he said, oh yeah, absolutely. Oh no, yes. We are trying to prevent the rise of a peer competitor. That's the nomenclature we use. So how do you prevent the rise of a peer competitor?
So hegemony should just be whatever we want, we get.
Well, in this case, I think for Biden, the idea is that we do this with close association with allies. Yep. We can't do it alone. So with NATO in Europe, with Japan, South Korea, we're trying hard to get ASEAN to come on board. Australia, this whole AUKUS agreement. So the idea is, we can't do it alone. That's true. But if we're really smart with our alliance management, then we can do this. You can call it offshore balancing. I think the realists call it offshore balancing. But my question is, if it really is becoming a more multipolar world, and if the threats facing us are global, it's like I want to come back to this dichotomy between geopolitics and these larger threats, right? Is it even in our interest to pursue this now? I just raised that question, but it still is the basic outlook in Washington.
I think Aaron's.
Yes.
Could you go into a little bit more detail on what policies you think the U.S. could, if you have any suggestions, what policies you think the U.S. could implement to strengthen their State Department if the systems are so bad? Are we past the point of return, or
Yeah,
can
I will.
you actually implement sustainable change?
Yeah. So, given what we're describing here, what concrete policies could we think of to strengthen the State Department? And and up our game on diplomacy. So the State Department has been arguing in recent years that there's a diplomacy gap with China. Remember the old missile gap? And so they're using that to try to get funding, but it hasn't worked. So, the number one issue is money. They've got to put money into it. Number two, and this is a defensive action, there's something called Schedule F. Now, this is something that the Trump administration didn't get through, but actually implemented. So at the State Department under Trump, something like 95% of upper-level appointments in the State Department were political appointees. We up until the Pendleton Act in 1883 and then the Foreign Service Act in 1924, we had a spoil system in this country. We really didn't have a professional bureaucracy. It was all contributors, who knew who. And there are elements of the Republican Party that want to bring us back to that. So Schedule F, if it passes, will allow any administration to fire at will any bureaucrat. And now this would allow them to get rid of professionals and then bring in loyalists, right? Which is what was happening at the State Department under Tillerson and Pompeo. So I worry that if this kind of thing goes through, we become almost like a pre-modern polity again. You know, Francis Fukuyama, you know, who wrote The End of History, you know, his latest works have all been about political, the essence of politics and the state. And he says that there are states, you know, that have a strong governmental infrastructure, you know, places like France, Japan. He says often these are countries that were feudal and had strong bureaucracies before they became democratic, and therefore it continued. He says that countries that went straight to democracy from nothing and didn't have this bureaucracy struggle to create one. So, and he puts the U.S., Greece in this category. So in his telling, we had the spoils system. It wasn't until the late 19th century that we became a more modern state with a functioning bureaucracy. And in his view, we are slowly sliding back again, away from that. Maybe that's a good thing. I mean, we have a deregulated economy. Maybe we should have a deregulated bureaucracy too. But it's exactly the opposite of what countries like China are doing, right? I mean, it's diametrically opposed to the kind of cadre billing that they do. So I guess so. I worry, frankly, at this point, I worry about defending what we have at state, a professional foreign service at all, and then building from there. I think that the reforms eventually take the form of opening it up more. We need a more diverse service. We need people coming in with skills. There'll be more kind of upper level entry where people will segue in, you know, as second careers. It won't be all kind of younger people coming in. But we need a lot more money for this. During Afghanistan and Iraq, thousands and thousands of positions at embassies were taken and put into Afghanistan and Iraq in what they call provincial reconstruction teams. And those positions, you know, like slots, were never returned to the embassies. So that's the other problem. We lack people, but we also lack positions that we need to reestablish. So it's a tall order, and I mean, they're talking about reform in state under Blinken, but it's going pretty slowly so far. So if you have any ideas, Aaron, I mean, Aaron was a State Department intern, actually, and he's an expert on virtual diplomacy and some of the new methods of diplomacy. So, yeah. Yes?
Didn't we exacerbate some of this by pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I mean, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if you look at it closely, it was part of the pivot. And as I said before, the pivot was primarily geopolitical. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership didn't do much for our economy. The real beneficiary would have been like Vietnam. But it was symbolically important of our involvement in Asia, right? The problem was that as people looked at it, they realized that it wasn't going to create a lot of American jobs. In fact, it was going to create jobs in places like Vietnam, and that's why Hillary eventually turned against it, right? In the 2016 campaign, both parties opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that's still the case to this day in Congress. Each party faces a domestic constituency that does not want the TPP. Now, the Japanese kept the agreement, renamed it. It's there waiting for us to rejoin someday. But in the meantime, this RCEP has taken off like a rocket. And the TPP can't really compete with that at the present time. So, yeah, I mean, we've had a rather militarized approach out in Asia, especially during the Obama and now the Biden years. And we need to get back to that. So, yeah, the question was about the TPP and the fact that we pulled out and ought to be in it. Any other questions or thoughts about? Yes.
So, last time, my husband and I were sitting in a lecture was almost exactly 10 years ago. That was 10 years.
With me?
1 month. My husband and I.
Okay. Was I the lecturer?
Not with you, but it's
Okay.
a lecture. So I appreciate this opportunity. And that was actually with Jimmy Carter, the former
Yes.
president.
Yes.
So I think that's the topic back then was challenges of a superpower.
Yeah.
That was hosted by the Commonwealth Club of California.
Interesting. Yes.
That complements this lecture
Yes.
One is, if there's one takeaway you would like the audience to bring back with them, what is that takeaway?
Okay.
Number one question. And the other one is, so I'm Chinese,
Yeah.
and my husband is American, and he's there. So you can imagine if we were sitting in China right now and listened to a lecture about China-U.S. relationship, how uncomfortable both of us might be.
Yes,
So the second question to you is, if there's one homework you would like us to do, given our background,
Yep.
what that homework might be.
What would the homework be? Oh boy. Okay, those are two. So the questions, one is what would be the main takeaway from this, in my view, and then secondly, what homework? I mean, what could you look into or study, right, or to try to understand the issue better? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Well, so the takeaway. I mean, I'm afraid. I mean, this is it. I'm afraid that people are fear-based. That fear is a motivator, and therefore threat analysis is what ultimately motivates policy. And so I think we need to have a more clear view of threats. We need to redefine the threats facing us. And I think if we do, we'll realize that China is not the number one threat. And in fact, nothing geopolitical is the number one for our country. Now, for Ukraine, yes, absolutely, or for smaller countries. But for the U.S., I mean, in terms of the U.S. national interest and the protection and well-being of the American population, there are issues that in my mind are higher up on the agenda. So I guess I wish that we would do a very rigorous threat analysis, an honest one, because that dichotomy I mentioned at the beginning would immediately pop up as something we've got to think harder about and not just let dangle, right? What is the priority? And actually, I didn't mention, but in the national security strategy, they cite a third threat that maybe is paramount, and that's our own domestic situation, including especially our own inequality. So I would say we should also really look at our early presidents and our early existence as a nation, we wanted to be a model. And the idea was, people will admire and emulate us. And that's the way we influence the world, right? I think we need to get back to a little more of that, as opposed to some of the very expensive involvements we've gotten into that have gone nowhere, frankly. That started with Vietnam. And so, yeah, I guess, yeah, that's what I would say and also just keeping in mind this dichotomy that's kind of been the theme going through between geopolitics and the global, what I call shared global threats that are going to require massive cooperation with countries like China, Russia, everybody else. And homework, well, a couple of the books I cited are pretty good. There's some excellent Chinese writers out there. I would advise reading a few Chinese voices on some of these issues. Yan Shuitong is a really top person. Wang Jixi. So there are people commenting in a very open and honest way about how things look from China. And so I think Americans ought to do more looking at that sort of thing. There's a basic concept in diplomacy, and I learned this when I first joined. Empathy. To understand, to get a country to do what you want it to do, you have to go all the way, empathetically, if you will, to understand what their concerns are and where they're coming from. It's not because you want to go local and join them in their quest. But there's a new concept that I think is popular on the web now. You can be what they call a dark empath. And what that means is somebody who is talking to you and, I understand I want to hear more about what you're doing. I want to hear exactly what you're going to, and they're doing that in order to manipulate you later. Right? And so these are called dark empaths. So, I mean, maybe, as a diplomat, you have to be a dark empath to a certain extent, but at least you've got to make the effort to understand the other side. Yes.
Your comment, and I'm going to make a comment, maybe you could comment back to it.
Yeah, good. It's like badminton. Yes.
The comment regarding professional State Department, whatever you want to call it, I think is something that is really, over the last many years, has been an issue. And my comment to that is a discussion I had when I lived in China with some of the bankers and some of the provincial government people, and that is we have the best government, both countries, that money can buy. And I look back at when the Supreme Court made some lofty decisions about, I mean, I don't mind if Amazon wants to spend $60 million to some candidate, but make it open so
Yeah.
that people know where the money is coming from.
Oh, yeah. No,
So that's my comment.
So the comment is just in terms of the State Department and the functioning of government and the fact that money is a big part of it, and that if we allow a system where money is flowing in sort of hidden ways and influencing policy and positions, that as a democracy we have to be aware of that, right? And yeah, and I mean, so many countries operate on the basis of patronage, right? I mean, this is unfortunate. In many sort of, once again, pre-modern countries, it'll be clan-based or even family-based. In the U.S., according to Fukuyama, it's been party-based always. We're a nation of many ethnicities. And so the one area that you could use was the political party structure. So a lot of the spoils are distributed by the parties, and they're up for sale. I mean, ambassadorships, quite frankly, are up for sale. And 30 to 40%, usually of the best posts, go to campaign contributors who then get sent to Norway or to London, or, Foreign Service officers are often sent to Africa and to, I mean, it breaks down that way. And it was even more that way in the 19th century, even more. So that's why things like Schedule F risk opening the floodgates to even more of that, right? And that's the danger. And it risks having the old party patronage system come back in full force. So yeah, it's important. And not to mention campaign contributors, with some of the Supreme Court decisions that have really opened the door for corporations as individuals and have kind of removed a lot of the limits on money in politics. So yeah, I mean, well.
I'm just thinking through as you're talking, there's kind of a disconnect between, we're getting to be hopeless at everything, and the Chinese are really good at everything. And yet the Chinese political system is exactly what we're talking about, is a patronage.
Yes.
Of warring factions.
Through the party.
Recent piece in Foreign Affairs about how this chap's a complete mediocrity, who kind of staggered in at last place with the lowest number of votes at each stage of his progress in his career. And this raises the frightening thought that political systems don't matter.
That it's human nature.
It's
human nature.
They are epiphenomenal, whilst other things are more important to the strength of a society and its powers.
Could well be. I mean, so I mentioned that China has a lot of problems to begin with, and some of the ones have had to do with the corruption that's been through the whole system for a long time. Especially at the regional level, a common pattern in Chinese history is that the regional governors, regional leaders are corrupt and exploit the peasantry, and the emperor loses track of what's going on and loses the mandate of heaven. And so I think that, like for Xi, I think that part of it is building his power, but I think he really is concerned that corruption delegitimizes the... I remember when the New York Times broke the story that the then premier, Wen Jiabao, Uncle Wen, who everyone loved, if ever there was like a catastrophe, Uncle Wen was there, that his mother was worth like $2 billion. And there was stunned silence in Beijing, and then the whole New York Times office was closed, and a lot of denials, right? And so, it's always human nature wherever you go. The question is whether an institutional party system, like I would argue that when our political parties were stronger at certain periods, well, maybe not, because a lot of the worst corruption was when our parties were strong. So I'll take that back. I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know all the details about Xi Jinping. I mean, Su Ye, who works at DEED, the trade office, she handles agriculture for Minnesota, and she went to school with Xi. And doesn't say he was a nonentity. He came from a very prominent family, in fact, very prominent family. And she gives a basically positive portrayal of him as she knew him, but that she's very surprised he ever became leader of China. She would not have predicted that. So that's along the lines of what you're saying. So, no, politics is politics. Yes?
Bottom line to it all. Can we both coexist in this world? Can the United States accept that it's number two? Can we get to a stage where we had it in the Cold War, mutual destruction, when we just stand off, each recognizing the situation?
To my mind, that should be possible. To my mind, that should be possible. So the question was, can we reach some kind of modus vivendi with China? It's not that long ago. Was it in the 2000? I think when George W. Bush came in, there was a lot of talk about a G2. You got the G20, you got the G7. The idea was, wait a minute, U.S. and China are on opposite sides of the globe. They're developing this incredible economic relationship. There are really no points of, at that time, Taiwan was a second-tier issue. Everyone was kind of following the one-China policy. So these two countries could kind of divide things up, and the world could be run by a G2. So that's just 20 years ago that people were talking in those terms. So, so both China and Russia blame us for waging proxy wars on their periphery, Ukraine and Taiwan, to contain them. We say this is all about democracy versus autocracy and values, and that we are defending these countries in that perspective, right? So how do you cut through those two narratives to reach an accommodation? But I don't see any casus belli between the two. China is still a developing country. It wants to have decent relations. We have to watch on the trade because they do subsidize, they do have a centralized system that doesn't respect all of it. One thing I've always been amazed at as I got to know China more and Chinese people too and looked at Chinese history, intellectual property theft is seen as a compliment to the person that all through Chinese history, people copy famous paintings and the copy is considered just as good as the original. Obviously, this doesn't justify intellectual property theft, but I think it's true that the Chinese have a slightly different view of it. It's like this is for if it's out there, it's for everybody, kind of a thing, right? I mean, we are unusually litigious as a country in these areas, right? We're at the other end of the intellectual property spectrum. So no, but and as I say, the U.S. and China have gone through these cycles of real fascination with each other, and then estrangement, and I guess it comes down to if we realize more and more that we're in the same boat in terms of the real issues, I think China's ready to cooperate with us. I think even Russia is probably too. But what do you do? What do you do with the aspirations of the Taiwanese and the Ukrainians? I mean, obviously this is important. So those are the big obstacles. I mean, if they really can work something out in Ukraine, that could be an example of kind of working through these kind of issues. Also, you saw Ron DeSantis say that Ukraine is not a vital U.S. national interest. That's his official position now. And there's big elements of the Republican Party that, the Tucker Carlsons and things who would agree on that. And so would a new administration really pull back from some of these commitments to small countries? I know a person like John Mearsheimer, who is all over the internet saying that Ukraine is the West's fault. It's all because of NATO expansion. His basic idea is we have to get things right with Russia because we need to focus on China and we need Russia. So Mearsheimer argues we should not be involved in the Middle East and we should not be involved in Ukraine because these are secondary issues to the real one. Right? So you've got all different voices out there on this. I don't know. I think especially between the U.S. and China, there ought to be a way of finding common ground. The new factor that really got things going was the technology, and as Washington began to realize that China was in fact pulling ahead in technologies that have military implications. That's part of why the alarm bells have been going off in a way that they weren't before. So.
Okay, well, I think we'll close there.
Thanks everybody for your patience. Yes.